All right. We still have 2 minutes for folks to join us, but for those of you who are already on the call, hello. Thank you for joining us. I'm Julianne Pinelli, one of the board co-chairs. While you wait, please put your name, agency, and email address into the chat box. And we'll get started in a couple minutes. Ty, question. Are you and LaKeysha going to share the screen the whole time, or should I advise people to put themselves on like a speaker view so they see who's speaking?
We probably will have the presentation up the entire time. So yeah, if they want to see us directly, they can do that. If they have dual screens, they can do it. Otherwise, it'll be up.
Yeah, I think if you're sharing your screen, they'll just, Helena, maybe you know.
Sorry, what was the question?
So I'm just wondering if I should tell people to put their screen view on speaker screen or like gallery view. But if they're going to be sharing their screen the whole time, it might not matter.
Yeah, if they're sharing their screen, if you're the host, you can actually spotlight either Tyrone or LaKeysha as they're speaking, and then everyone will only see them.
Oh, how do I do that? The 3 dots?
Yep.
Okay. Spotlight video. Nice. Okay. Then I don't have to say that. Perfect. All right. Well, I see a lot of folks joining us. It is 11 on the dot. Is LaKeysha here yet? I don't want to start until
she is there.
She's here. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well, thank you. All right, so it's 11. Let's get started. I'm Julianne Pinelli. I am one of the board co-chairs for New York City VOAD, and we're here for a presentation on social vulnerabilities in disaster. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we start, I just want to run through a few Zoom housekeeping items. We know that the invitation for today's presentation was shared widely, and so we want to make sure that we keep in contact with anyone here that might be here for the first time. So please write your name, agency, and email address in the chat box. Email is extremely important for those of you who we don't have your email address yet. The video is being recorded, and we will send this video to you after the meeting, to everyone on our mailing list and everyone who shares the email today. And finally, please keep yourself muted unless you are speaking. If we hear an open mic, we will mute you. So please don't be offended by that. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Helena Duran of New York Disaster Interface Services and the current chair of our Racial Justice and Equity Committee, so she can introduce our presenters today.
Excellent, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So today we are joined by Tyrone Ford and LaKeysha Fields. They will be presenting their Social Vulnerabilities Index and how it relates to racial equity in disasters. So we are very glad to have them here with us this morning, and I'll go ahead and let them take it away.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm LaKeysha Fields. I work at the Salvation Army here in St. Louis. I'm the Assistant Social Services Director for our Midland Division, covering the state of Missouri and the southern half of Illinois. And with me is my partner in crime, Tyrone Ford. Tyrone, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself. Get off mute, Ty. Did the host mute you? If the host muted you, then I think the host has to unmute you.
I don't think I did.
But while he's figuring out, I can introduce him. So Tyrone Ford is the Director of Service Integration at Catholic Charities of Greater St. Louis, covering a federation of nine, right? Agencies, or 12. he can correct me when he gets off mute. So we are really going to just be sharing with you all some of the work that we've done. Both of our positions at our respective organizations include overseeing what we might call a disaster social services, or that disaster response and recovery that includes the direct service to individuals. So we've worked on several disasters over the years. I know ours probably don't get as much attention, but here in the St. Louis metro area, we've been in a constant state of disasters for the last like 6 years, some of them overlaying the others. So we're just going to share some of the things that we've learned when it comes to social vulnerabilities in disasters. We regret, of course, that we can't be there in person, so we don't get to do some of the fun activities that we have scheduled. And if you haven't figured it out yet, Tyrone and I do this show a lot, and so we're kind of casual about it. We want people to loosen up. It's learning, but it should be interesting as well. Please feel free to put questions in the comments. Julianne or Helena, if we could ask one of you to monitor those. As we're sharing our screens, we might not be able to see them, but we are open to questions during. You don't have to wait until the very end. All right, well, I am going to share my screen if I can. Okay, and are you guys seeing this?
We are.
Okay, awesome. So this is the road to addressing social vulnerabilities and disasters, and of course the question of, are we there yet? So during disasters, you know, Catholic Charities, Salvation Army, we're among some of the names that you guys probably hear when things go on in disasters. So this journey for us really started in the flood of 2015 that really coursed the bi-state area something fierce. We had 12 marks. If you're not familiar with the term MARC, it stands for Multi-Area Resource Center. And that's a bunch of agencies getting together in one place to deliver services to survivors of a disaster. So that was 12 marks over 10 days across 2 states, and a disaster recovery program spanning 15 months. But before we could finish that one, in April 2017, we had another flood. Some of the families were re-impacted, and then there were other new ones. So we went about it again, 18 marks in 10 days, and this recovery program spanned 20 months. We banded together with other organizations. In this picture, there's obviously us and Salvation Army, Catholic Charities. There's Lutheran Children Family Services, the American Red Cross, just a bunch of us banded together to do kind of a coordinated response because of these issues. And we got an award for our response, the What's Right with the Region Award. So we thought, yes, we did it. That's everybody. We took care of the issues. Or is it? Did we really help everyone? What we came to find was that there were groups in our St. Louis area who had been overlooked twice. They have been overlooked in both disasters, 2015 and 2017 flood. There was an apartment complex specifically that they had not even heard about any of the resources. Both of these floods were declared with FEMA, and so there were federal resources available, and they had not known anything about them. There were other things like our Salvation Army Christmas programs. The Catholic Charities and Salvation Army both have programs that are kind of long-term case management, Pathway of Hope for TSA and Pathways to Progress for Catholic Charities. Both of those, we encountered families who would come to us for immediate assistance, but once we would dig down deep to see what the root cause was, a lot of times it was the flood. And unfortunately, that far out, those same disaster resources were not available to them. There was personal contacts. There were people who, during these 18 or 10 marks, had no clue that those were happening. And it was really only because they happened to call us or somebody they knew during the time that we were working the mark that they found out. So we wanted to know, how did it happen? How was it that certain areas had no clue what was going on as far as resources and their ability to recover? One of the reasons that we had to look at was that St. Louis is one of the 5th most segregated major cities in the US. This is a map of the segregation in St. Louis. The bluer sections are the concentration of European American, and the maroon sections, those are the concentrations of African Americans. And so you can see that it's pretty segregated. For those of you who don't know, this line here is kind of the separation of the bi-state area. So on the left you have Missouri, and on the right is Illinois, separated by the Mississippi River. But this area is St. Louis city and county, and then we consider wider the metro area. So it's pretty segregated. And then interestingly enough, this second map over here, this is actually the poverty concentration. So the higher the level of poverty is in red, and the lower is in blue. And so if we overlay these maps, we are seeing some interesting and unfortunate correlations that we already know exist, right? These aren't surprises to us. But where there are a concentration of African Americans in segregation, there are also socioeconomic impacts with that. The other thing that we noticed about how that really impacted our response was that if we go back to this map over here, you see these 3 stars, the map on the left, the 3 stars, those are the locations where we had our marks. So the entire area was impacted by flooding, but we had our marks in areas that had high concentration of European Americans, and really left out the area that was highly African American and the areas that had more poverty concentration. And obviously that was not something that we did intentionally. We didn't even notice until several years later when we went back to see how other people had been overlooked so often. So I'm going to hand this part to Tyrone to ask about why should we care about what we've discovered.
Thank you, and I apologize for my internet interruption issues. I had to connect hardline for whatever our Wi-Fi was going ballistic. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Good, okay. So this presentation, as you know, is meant to be interactive. It's not for us to just talk and for you to just listen. So if Julianne or Helena can monitor the chat for a couple seconds, I want to ask the question to the group here. I think there's 60 some people on this chain here on this Zoom. Why should we care as service providers? Why should we care about the vulnerable population, the population that is most affected by natural disasters? If someone can jump in the chat and just give your answers, and we'll have Julianne and Helena call those out to us. I want to get some perspective from the group of their thoughts on why we as service providers should care about this topic.
Equity.
Yeah, equity. What else?
We're not afraid to call on people either. We do that.
You know, we can do that. We do that real well, don't we? Why don't I jump in and just pick some, you know, Jay looks interesting to me. Jay, you look like you got a whole lot going on in the background. What do you think about why we should care?
For me, I think you want to get the services to those that most need the services. So I I really, someone just put it in the chat box, but I swear I got it up first. So if you have a neighborhood with low resources, a high rate of poverty, then we got to get those resources into that neighborhood directly.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. LaKeysha, go ahead and throw up 2 or 3 of the thoughts that we had. So there's trauma. You can stop there. There's trauma and disasters, mental and emotional health. Recently, at least in the last couple of years, there's been a really good focus on crisis intervention during disasters. And so a lot of people are understanding case management alone, while it's good and case work ahead of time and responding to natural disasters in terms of destruction of property, that we have to take into account that people are mentally and emotionally affected. And there's physical injury that occurs, as you know, with tornadoes and things like that. So go ahead, you can put them all up. Compounding existing barriers, folks lose possessions and homes. I like that. Somebody read that for me in the chat. I just see systemic racism.
Because it calls out systemic racism that has to be corrected.
Yes. Home and community poverty. And then there's the domino effect, the trauma after the trauma, right? So your children are affected negatively. Small businesses tend to close or are significantly affected. Insurance costs goes up. Property values tend to go down because people leave the area because they can't either afford to maintain that, didn't have insurance, or no longer want to be affected by disasters if it's a disaster-stricken area. And then the community resources, and for the record, we'll get into poverty and racism here shortly. Community resources are stressed, right? So if there are organizations that are serving people that are vulnerable already, imagine how they're being taxed when there's a disaster, that they now have a whole set of population of folks who had previously not been accessing resources, now accessing resources. Take COVID, for instance, that we're in. A lot of people for the first time in their life are having to seek out resources where they have not had to before. And that's crossing all socioeconomic barriers. And then local support agencies. Next slide.
Can I just interject? I mentioned before that we found out a lot of this information when we were doing direct service at our agencies. And unfortunately, because a lot of the people who were impacted but were overlooked, that time had lapsed. Those federal, you couldn't apply for FEMA anymore. That was closed. So they didn't get the federal resources. Our agencies had pretty much closed the disaster. And so we didn't have those extra funds. So when we think about they were left out and they didn't get those resources, and then by the time it got so bad they needed help, we couldn't help them in the way we would have been able to years before. They were limited to exactly what we could give everybody else in that moment if they qualified. So really, when we think about the community resources being stressed, you know, it's timeliness. And Tyrone mentioned the pandemic. You know, if anybody's working on any grants for that money's here, but they need it spent by a certain day. So when we're not doing that, when people aren't being able to access it and it's gone, it's really impacting them negatively.
Correct. And, you know, when you force, LaKeysha brings up an interesting point about the grants. You are forcing agencies that want to do short-term, intermediate, and long-term work in disaster to compress it all down to a 6-month period when we know that, one, it's not enough time, and usually the resources that we have aren't even enough to cover all the issues that people are facing. So just something to think about as we continue on in this next slide. So social vulnerabilities, what are they and what do we do about them? So this is another chat question. What do you guys consider to be social vulnerabilities?
Good question, Tyrone. Let's see what they have to say about it.
I know.
Hi, this is Lauren Campbell. I'm going to actually I'm with the visiting nurse service in New York, but I'm also an elder and clerk of session of the Presbyterian Church of St. Albans. So I'm going to really speak more on the social vulnerability of from my aspect of dealing with the church in my community, and I feel that is the lack of information as well as misinformation is a social vulnerability. We're trying to rely on a lot of hearsay because some communities do not have access to the right information or resources. And it comes back to why should we care about social equity and injustices. I think the vulnerability is the fact that there's a lot of misinformation or a lack of information that's being that's in the community, within the community, and also our leadership. They're pulled in so many different ways, and even including our political leaders as well as some of our religious leaders. It becomes overwhelming for them to try and provide this information unless they have a really decent support group. We're basically in the Southeast Queens area, and in response to this pandemic, we did develop some unique relationships and networking, but in that we did find a lot of gaps, and where we definitely needed additional resources and where other communities may have had that. And we also see how the miseducation and misinformation is going along with a lot of the increase in possible cases because of the fact that there's no one really getting out to the communities to explain how high risk this type of pandemic is, and in terms of any other type of emergency threats or hazards.
You bring up an interesting point. We're going to get into later on in the presentation. We talk about what things we can do in gray sky, i.e. when a disaster is happening, and then blue sky, what can we do outside of a disaster to really address some of the issues around particularly or lack of information in certain areas. We're going to definitely jump into that a little bit later, Lauren. Anybody else on what are some specific social vulnerabilities? Racine, you cannot answer the question.
I was going to say, there's a few things in the chat too.
Go ahead.
If you want me to, okay. Yeah. Structural disenfranchisement that intentionally and otherwise puts undue burden on a group of people. Yeah. Nice. Some things that were also named were poverty, class, race, religion, gender, age, disability, language, anything that puts people on the wrong end of prejudice creates social vulnerability.
Awesome. You guys act like you've been to this presentation before. LaKeysha, you want to
Some of us may have.
Anything that they just said? So obviously, when we talk about social vulnerability, and we have others, and you guys have listed others, if you wrap all this up into a ball, someone said it earlier, which was anything that prevents people from accessing the appropriate services, resources, or their ability to thrive in the environment in which they live. So we listed a few, you guys got them all, and then the other ones that we listed. And really the point of all this is a social vulnerability, one, is all relative, right? And two, can be literally almost anything, right? It could be where you live, where you stay, how many kids you have, your language barrier. It could be access to public transportation. Jill, thank you. It can be almost literally anything that's preventing you from being able to thrive or be successful in what you're trying to do. And so any others that we haven't mentioned before we move on?
I think access to healthcare, access to fresh produce, internet connectivity.
As we found in COVID, particularly when schools let out early for the year, there were quite a few households who did not have internet connectivity, one, or even computers or tablets. And the schools only have so many, right? They don't have one for every student that may need it. And what we found, at least we did here in St. Louis, is that we had some companies that were willing to donate the equipment but couldn't afford to keep the internet going. We had some companies that could do the internet but couldn't do the equipment. So we had to find a way to match them up together. And even then, it may have been a hotspot through a cell company, or it may have been limited internet through one of the service providers here in St. Louis. And so lack of childcare law, I see that. But COVID has really exposed a lot of vulnerabilities for folks. And what we did here, I neglected to mention this in the beginning, when COVID hit, for our organization, I know LaKeysha did this as well, we considered this a disaster. We immediately internally classified this as a disaster.
Yes.
And that allowed us to free up funding, to free up staff, to go after certain funding from disaster providers that normally wouldn't otherwise provide funding in a pandemic as such a healthcare issue. But because of the nature of it, the widespreadness of it, and how it acted like a disaster, we had to employ our efforts here in our organization to bring on additional staff and that sort of thing to make sure that we could respond. So, any questions so far? Legal status, yes. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So, what is social justice? She says, Tyrone, who declared it a disaster? Our agency did.
Yeah. We made that decision. We were actually at Salvation Army, we were doing our disaster seminar that weekend, and we got the first inkling that something was going on. And we said, you know what, we need a coordinated response. It has to be widespread. It's going to affect everywhere. It's going to affect us internally, not just externally, like we normally serve in a disaster area. So we knew we needed a crisis management. And so we erected our incident command system right away in mid-March. And that for us was a decision made within our headquarters.
Thank you. So really just to kind of wrap this portion of it up in terms of the declaration of it. And actually, for those of you who don't know, FEMA declared it, but they declared it for public support so that the healthcare agencies could get testing, so that they could employ staff, so that they would have the support they needed to start to combat this. Now, for FEMA to declare it lets me know that they were sort of quasi-declaring it a disaster. Because if you don't know FEMA, of course, you guys know it's Federal Emergency Management. So it's declared an emergency, and they usually handle the disaster portion of it. Not that it didn't come from Health and Human Services as well, but the fact that FEMA was involved let us know that it was widespread enough that they thought it necessary to declare it a disaster, just not an IA type of declaration that was normal. So we thought we had made that decision internally just so that we could treat it as such. And that was our decision, and thank you. So what is social justice? Anybody want to give out a general definition of what you think social justice is? I'm going to open this thing up and see who I haven't heard from. Who is M. O'Connell? Say hi to everybody.
Calling people out.
Hi there. Kind of a very big topic, but I would say it's some biting systemic or ingrained ideas that cause inequality.
Perfect and succinct. I like it. Let's go to Amy. Amy, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
How are you? How would you define social justice?
I mean, I think it's a big topic. It's been a big issue, especially now, but I feel like the best way to describe social justice would be equality and making sure everyone feels safe and is treated the right way.
Wonderful. Miss, last one, Jamaica Carter.
So social justice to me, or from what I know, is equity, which is everyone having what they need. Especially in this country, a lot of people have had, a lot of help and support, and other people have not. And so there are different, you know, privileges that people have and disadvantages that others have. And so social justice would be equity for everyone, which is like getting people what they need, not necessarily like everyone having the same thing.
Wonderful, wonderful. You are spot on, and we're going to jump into that equity versus equality conversation here in a second. So here's a standard definition, right? So if you look up, if you Google it, or you get a book, or what I call Webster and them, this is sort of the way they define it. And so, you know, the way in which human rights are manifested in everyday lives of people at every level of society, or justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, privileges within society, which some of you mentioned. So, go ahead. How do we, i.e. Tyrone and LaKeysha, define social justice, right? Particularly in the construct of disaster. And for us, it's the assurance, right, that each person affected by disaster has access, notice the word access, to the multitude of available disaster response and recovery resources, regardless of geographical location, language, socioeconomic, race, religion, or any other barriers. We left that open for a reason. Our job and we are both clinicians by background, our job is to eliminate barriers first. The fact that a disaster is on top of that just gives us a different way to do it. And so one of the things that we've been very instrumental here in St. Louis is to get away, I shouldn't say get away for it, to complement or supplement the disaster response process. And be able to do what we do in long-term recovery, regardless of what they are currently going through, and not to just leave them with the standard definition of, say, sanitary and secure, but to go beyond and start to create resiliency among the population, right? And to move on, intentionality in providing an equitable, as we were mentioning earlier, form of outreach, intake, assessment, and service delivery. The young lady who spoke earlier about outreach, that really, I think that was Lauren, that really gets into the conversation around where do we put information about marks? Where do we put information about resources? Are we just advertising on, you know, here in St. Louis, we have Fox 2 or Channel 4 or 5. Are we going to different areas where they frequent, the local grocery store and putting out flyers, the local hair salon or beauty shop where they frequent, individuals in certain areas frequent, the body shop, you know, the rental car place, places where folks go in the community that may not have access to certain TV stations or TV or internet or social media, or their phones aren't, you know, prepared for them to do any of that. So we have to think outside of the box. We have to think about the population. But I will tell you, and I'm getting a little ahead when I tell you, we should probably have some of these people at the table when we're having conversations about what to advertise. So we'll get into that in a minute. Some of you guys are smiling and shaking your head. So let's move on. So that's how we define social justice.
Before we move on, Ty. So one of the things, if you guys remember the slide that showed the maps, and it had the stars on where our marks were. I want to just emphasize that those locations were, I believe they were like large churches that had the gyms or whatever, or the schools that we could do a large mark in. And so on the surface, it looked like this is a good space. This is what we need. But hindsight is 2020, right? We weren't intentional when we were looking for locations that would provide access to everyone. We were unfortunately replicating the barriers that existed. A lot of those, there weren't bus lines out there, you know, that went to those locations. So, you know, geography made a difference, especially with us being so segregated in St. Louis. We had to really start to look intentionally at the decisions that we were making and really taking a step back to consider all of these vulnerabilities, even in the fast pace of a disaster. Okay, now I'll move on next for you, Tyrone.
Hold on a second.
What?
This is why I love these presentations, LaKeysha. We have a challenge in the chat.
What?
And I'm going to read it because I want us to kind of take a couple minutes and just highlight this. And I want to ask this person to then respond to the challenge of what we need to do differently about it. So it says, this is Miss Leslie Foltz Morrison. She says, but disaster services have long been weighted towards homeowners rather than renters, much less those experiencing homelessness. So access to resources is not quite enough since the resources have been skewed. I'd love for us to take 3 or 4 minutes, Keisha, if you're okay with that, for people in the group to respond to that, and then you and I will add some thoughts, because we're doing some creative things here in St. Louis around this measure. So, so you guys feel free to, or even Leslie, if you want to expand on that comment or some thoughts around what the fix is, I'd love for you guys to take that, if that's okay. Helena.
Yes, I'm Leslie, and I will respond. I am proud that our organization, NIDIS, New York Disaster Interface Services, is working more to include a focus on people who are experiencing homelessness is part of our disaster response. And so working with congregations who can provide volunteer-led shelters is an area that we have just been moving into in the last year. So in terms, it needs to be on more of our voluntary groups' radar, I think, for disaster response. But also we need to push, as Americans, push our federal government to restructure FEMA individual assistance so it's not just so much towards homeowners. Because when people are flooded, even homeless people lose everything. And so we haven't had, because we've made the tests so high for people to prove that they lost everything in a flood, you know, I mean, they're not gonna have a deed that could be found at City Hall that showed where their belongings were ruined. So we have to think differently and advocate as voluntary organizations for those who are homeless.
I love it.
I do. I love it. Anybody else on the call want to talk about what they may be doing in their area around this issue of renters and homeless services?
Yeah, this is Io from LES Ready, and actually, in addition to restructuring FEMA, I think it actually has to start with federal legislation, because a federal legislation is what determines what FEMA can and cannot do, what they can and cannot give out. And here in New York City, one of the issues, in addition to people who are homeless, that we face during disaster is how FEMA can or cannot help low-income condos, co-op, and Mitchell Llamas. So none of those entities, which are a huge source of affordable housing here, are eligible for FEMA assistance. So we have on the Lower East Side a building with 420 something units. All of their infrastructure was ruined during Sandy, but they were not eligible for any assistance through FEMA, as opposed to all of the others, because of the bill itself, the legislation. So that's, I think, what we really have to look at, in addition to the internal interpretation of the policies of FEMA.
I think that is absolutely correct, 100%.
Definitely.
Okay.
And I love how I'm hearing that we're looking at the structures, you know, where did this start and who is being left out? Definitely our homeless neighbors were not considered when it came to disasters. Yes, renters are on the lower end, and those are the ones who we see the most who can't recover on their own. And so getting down to the why and the how and being able to value everyone in a society, that's right. We were talking about social justice. So looking at disasters through a social justice lens, not just a lens of equality, but it's really not, because we went into this only considering one sector, those who are homeowners and or who live in a certain area, and how we can help them recover. So I'm loving it. I'm taking notes, guys. I'm taking notes.
Oh, someone says especially if they don't have a lease, right? Like if you don't have a lease to qualify for the funding that's available, good luck, right? So you guys keep considering and thinking about that. We'll come back to that here shortly, and talk a little bit more about some opportunities for us to advocate. So take it back.
My bad.
All right, so let's get into, you guys have mentioned, a couple of you so far have mentioned this equality versus equity. Largely people have talked about equality, right? Equal rights, equal justice, equal treatment, fair treatment. And so I think what we have to do is help people understand the difference between the two and why equity is so much more important, particularly in disasters, than equality. Not that equality is not important. I think, that's the basis or the baseline for what we do. Equal is the bare minimum, but equitable treatment is the goal. And so in my standard fashion of asking questions, who can tell me, I think somebody started it earlier, I can't remember, the difference between equality and equity? And use whatever analogies or thoughts you have. And if you don't want to talk, throw them in the chat. Otherwise, I like calling on people. The same difference between acknowledging racism and being anti-racist. Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
Right there. Are you writing that down, Keisha? I'm not taking it.
I'm writing it down.
Love it. Who else? Equity and equality.
I'll repeat what I've heard once, and I may have said this before in a couple of other settings. But someone described it once as equality being giving everybody a size 7 shoe or 2 size 7 shoes, and equity is giving everyone a pair of shoes that actually fits them.
Nice. Nice. There we go. We love those analogies. And actually someone put in the chat, somebody read that most recent chat, second to last one before Karen.
Equality is making sure everyone receives the same, and equity is everyone receiving what they need.
Voila. Go ahead and put it up there. All right. So most of you have said it, you know it. You know the reason why people are really starting to look at equity instead of the equality. So giving everyone the same thing, that's great, right? I had this recent conversation yesterday with someone. I said, if I have, an apple and an individual comes to me and says they're hungry and I give them an apple, it's probably gonna be good for them. It's probably gonna fill them up. It's probably gonna give them something to go on for the next couple of hours or so. If I get an individual that has 3 kids and I have 1 apple, is that going to help them, right? It may split that in half and help the kids, but then, the parent may have an issue. And we look at it as giving people what they need to enjoy a full and healthy life, okay? Equality should be the goal when everyone is starting from the same place. Equity should be implemented when people are starting with certain disadvantages. And so what's interesting about equity is this social vulnerability all started because we did not recognize the inequities that existed in our disaster recovery system here in St. Louis. And taking 2 people who are clinicians by trade, when we found out, we sort of took the thing and ran with it. And it has really become a topic of discussion for us at the Red Cross, at the United Ways here, at the Salvation Army, the funders, the service providers, your community action agencies, your St. Vincent de Paul's. Everyone is really starting to look at how are we treating folks that are recovering from disasters in a more equitable fashion. And so we found this little video here that's a great illustration. It's about 3 minutes. that really gives an example of the equity and equality conversation. So we're going to jump off a share, jump back on share to show it, but let's see if it works.
You sharing yours, Ty?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm not.
Oh, so we both waiting on each other to share it. Is that what's happening?
I'm sorry. I only have the PowerPoint up.
What? Okay, here we go, guys. I'm going to share it.
Thank you.
No problem.
And in full disclosure, that's my fault. I was supposed to have it up. So Keisha, I won't leave that on you.
Today we are talking about.
Okay, hold on now. Let me see. And all right, are you guys seeing the video?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, now I'll play it.
Today we are talking about equity and equality. But you might be wondering, wait, aren't these the same thing? They look the same. They sound similar. So aren't they the same? No, in fact, they're really different concepts, even though a lot of us get the two confused. So let's break them down. You probably already know what we mean when we say equality. We're talking about two things that are the same or have a similar value. When we treat two people or two groups of people equally, we make sure that they have or get the same things. For example, if I want to give Betty some apples, then I need to give Ben the same number of apples to treat them with equality. Along the same lines, if I want to give the nursing program a budget increase, then I need to make sure that I give the culinary arts program the same budget increase to treat them with equality. That makes sense. But that's not the same thing as equity. Equity can be defined as giving everyone what they need to be successful. In other words, it's not giving everyone the exact same thing. And here's where the difference between equity and equality really come in, because it's important to remember that if we give everyone the exact same thing, expecting that we'll make people equal, it assumes that everyone started out in the same place. So here's an example. In this instance, we give everyone the exact same box. We treat them with equality so that they can see over the fence. Well, that's great for the person on the left because they were already taller, but it's not so great for the person on the right who still can't see over the fence. From an equity perspective, we wouldn't want everyone to have the same size box because everyone isn't the same height to start out with. With an equity mindset, we would get everyone what they need to raise them up to the same level. Here's another example. With equality in mind, we can treat everyone the same and give them all the same bike, but that doesn't really help the person on the left who can't ride that kind of bike, or the person in the middle that is too small for that bike. So when we think about this situation with equity in mind, equity tells us that we need to give everybody a different kind of bike so they can all enjoy a bike ride. As you might guess, this is where the concept of fairness gets tricky for some folks. We often think that being fair means that everybody gets the same thing, and that's what we were taught when we were growing up. But fairness really only works when we're all the same to start out with. So this is a new idea for many of us to think about. There is this great American saying that people just need to work hard enough and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. It's this idea that everyone can be successful if you just work hard enough. Well, that's a lot easier to do when some of us were born with longer arms to pull up those bootstraps, or maybe we were given longer bootstraps when we bought our boots. So let's think about moving away from the bootstrap idea and instead think about shoes. There is a quote by Naheed Dasani that goes, "Equality is giving everyone a shoe, but equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits."
I just wanted you guys to enjoy that music for a second. All right, let's get back to sharing the other screen.
So I hope that kind of gave a really good description of what we need to be doing in terms of equity when it comes to this presentation. So we normally would have an activity here. And so we thought we were going to try to share the clip from an earlier presentation, but I couldn't get it brought down enough and I couldn't get the volume up enough in my editing software. So we're going to skip that. And so let's get to the tools. And I think I'm gonna turn it back over to LaKeysha.
Yeah, you are. All right, thanks, Tyrone. So let's get to the tools. So we talked about social justice. We talked about social vulnerabilities. We talked about equality versus equity. So now what do we do with this knowledge, or what have we done? What we've done is in cohorts here in St. Louis is we've decided to look at disasters through a social justice lens. So not just a impacts for property and destruction or whatever, but we want to look at it through social justice for the actual people who are impacted. So we broke it down into 3 categories. What is the vulnerability? What is the barrier? And then what is an intervention for that? So who are the groups affected by this event, and what are the impacts or potential impacts on that group, and how do we, again, that word intentionally, how do we involve stakeholders who are also members of the communities affected by the event? And then the other set of questions that we should ask ourselves, and these are questions that we would suggest could be a good starting point for groups such as this one, or if you go back to smaller coads or even your own agencies to say, this could be a starting point. Let's ask these questions and see if we actually have answers to them yet. Does the event have a potentially disproportionate impact on certain communities? And you guys definitely brought up our homeless neighbors, renters, communities of color, low income communities, and then of course there's the barrier. What are they that would really stop more equitable outcomes? And somebody said, I'm sorry, I don't see everybody's name, but the young lady mentioned FEMA and the legislation, and that, you know, that is a barrier to an equitable outcome. So some of these barriers are political in nature, and so the intervention would probably need to address that. So that's kind of our social justice lens framework that we wanted to start from. And then we looked at, well, are there any tools or interventions out there that would help identify social vulnerabilities in a disaster? And so we know that the government, the CDC, our friends these days, have a social vulnerability index. And they have divided that into 4 categories: socioeconomic, households, minority status and language, and housing and transportation. And they have put those categories into different aspects so that you can see there. And those are the websites if you want to visit and explore. The other tool that exists is Catholic Charities USA has a disaster operations map. And this map is super cool. You put in an area and the map comes up, and as you scroll over that area, it gives you the same categories that were on this side. It gives you here on their map, and it tells you your population impact. So if we're looking at socioeconomic status, it tells us how many individuals are living below the poverty level in that area. And so you can do this for the entire United States. You can go by vulnerability, or you could go by hazard risk. And of course, you know, I'm sure now they're working on like pandemic category since we're in COVID now. But these interventions exist. Another intervention that we've used, and some of you are probably familiar with, is the CAN tier system. And that is a tool for prioritizing need for people who have survived a disaster. So it's divided into 4 tiers, and you guys can read those, but it lets us know, you know, Sally was in tier 1 because she, her immediate needs were met, but she has some remaining unmet needs. Or Joe was in tier 4 because his needs have been unmet and he might lack the capacity to actually meet them on his own. And so that's a tool that we've used during declared disasters to categorize people based on the property destruction and a little bit on their socioeconomic background. Then what we saw the gap in actually assessing individuals for their social vulnerabilities and being able to address the service delivery based on their specific household or individual vulnerability. So we created the Disaster Social Vulnerability Assessment. We took those same categories that the CDC and Catholic Charities USA were using, and we broke them down into those 4 categories, but a scoring system. So for example, someone who their economic status is very high, it's because they're unemployed or income below the poverty level or no GED. This was created a little bit in thinking of the Arizona self-sufficiency matrix that both of our organizations use for our long-term case management. So we took some ideas from that. We combined it with the existing information on social vulnerabilities, and we created this scale or assessment. This has gone through several iterations, and this is the latest one. So if any of you actually sat in on our previous presentations for National BOAD or the New York presentation, this looks different. We upgraded because we've been using this assessment during disasters. We talked about 2015 flood and then 2017 flood. We also had a 2019 flood. And so we are actually still in recovery for that right now, in addition to the pandemic. So we've got a lot of opportunities to use this assessment. And so we've updated as we've seen how it's turned out. So this is what the assessment actually looks like. This is what you would apply to an individual or household. The next screen is the scoring. And so we have just how we get a score based on those questions. And our caseworkers or case managers or even volunteers who are perhaps at a mark or doing service are able to administer the assessment, and then they get the score. And here in the yellow is the score range. So once someone has we've identified what their score is and what category, right now our agencies then determine what we're going to do with that information. Right, so we've got the score, and there are several ways that it can be used in the response time when we're doing marks and we're giving out food and we're doing emergency shelters, all those things. For example, we at the Salvation Army, we have attached at a mark, we might give out emergency financial assistance. So we might give like a gift card. Let's say we give it $100 gift card to someone because of their level of damage and the number in their household. Well, we have done the assessment on them for vulnerabilities, and based on their vulnerability score, we have given them an additional amount of financial assistance. And so that's how we've used it in response. And then in recovery, the score can be used to prioritize which cases get served first. especially in, you know, a pandemic where we've discovered everybody is impacted. We get hundreds of calls. Who do we serve first? Who do we give our attention to? And so knowing that the people who might have very high vulnerability also are the least likely to be able to recover on their own, your staff might be able to use that score to prioritize which cases need the most attention or which cases need the most additional support services. Tyrone, do you want to talk about how you guys have used it, have used the score at Catholic Charities?
Yeah, very similar, Keisha. We typically will use this to triage, right? As everyone knows, you get, particularly after a disaster, after the short term, after everyone's gone, you get those people that are left sort of fending for themselves. And so we often use this to really get at the heart of who is in need, based on the criteria, the scale that the questions before. And it really helps us to put them into sections, right? How quickly can we get to someone? How can we address their need? It also helps us to determine what other programming they need to be referred to in addition. So we use this to triage, we use it to provide aid and assistance, but also if they're high vulnerability, and based on the questions that we ask, and we determine that there are other services that are necessary, it helps us make referrals to those either internal programs that do long-term case management or external programs that our partners obviously operate. So we want to make sure that we are using this in an effective way, but using it sort of in a holistic way that we can really use it to triage folks, to get them the help as quickly as possible to help them recover, but recognizing that, you know, they will have additional vulnerabilities, and so we need to be prepared to handle those as well as a social service organization.
Mm-hmm. And you'll notice up top where it says the damage assessment impact, it's destroyed, major, minor, affected. And we use those same ones that the American Red Cross uses, at least in our area, when they do their assessments, their property assessments. We wanted to keep everything as streamlined and familiar as possible. And then, of course, COVID came along, and we actually had to adjust the impact categories to make sense for a pandemic. And so Tyrone and I got together and figured, okay, how do we correlate these? And this might be something that has to happen per disaster at agencies, but the impact category, because we weren't talking about destruction of property, we updated those and gave more definition here on the right of what that looks like. So destroyed rather than your home floated down the river, destroyed or full impact now can mean you're homeless or in transition, you have an eviction notice, no income, or a household member is deceased due to COVID. And then we went along down those other categories of impact, so that translated in this pandemic environment that we're in. We were able to get some information, some data from using the assessments for our most recent flooding for 2019. And as you can see, most of the individuals either scored low or medium in their assessments of their vulnerabilities. And this was just an example of what you can do with the data that you have. So if I have the data on the depth of vulnerability and I have those numbers and those scores, I can use this information to present to whether it's my own internal organization or an external group or a government or a support system, other stakeholders who we're serving. So we're serving people, and if the majority of them have very high vulnerabilities, what have we done to address that? Have we directed more service? Have we directed more attention to that? Of course, we know it with COVID, eventually the existing structural inequities raised themselves during COVID, and communities of color, specifically African Americans, were disproportionately impacted. And that eventually rose to the top, but a lot of times we're not necessarily looking at those things in disasters, and we need to be. So we're just getting at the tip of the iceberg and how we can use this data, but we're getting a lot of exercise and opportunity in actually collecting it.
I would add, to that point, Keisha, whenever we're writing grants, most of you are familiar with grant writing, they ask for data, who you're serving, where you're serving, what do you plan to serve, and we always give them historical data. That is one of our number one, I think, qualifiers, is that we can tell them, 60% of our population that we serve have shown high vulnerability in previous disasters or something like that. So it really helps as a data tool to use in part of grant writing as well. So just want to throw that note out there.
Thanks, Ty. I'm going to pause to give a second if anybody has questions that they want to put in the comments or ask about the actual tool that we created.
We actually had a question come in. Can you hear me? Of how you would like this presentation to be cited if we were to use it after this presentation. Do you have a preferred citation method?
Do we, Ty? Do we have a preferred citation method?
We have not done any, intellectual data, intellectual. Anyway, I would just say, formed by Catholic Charities, Salvation Army in St. Louis for now.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. And we have, we've shared it widely, we've given it, we've probably done ourselves a disservice by not, copywriting, but, if you know anything about copyright, it's intellectual data is part of it at the moment of conception, so it doesn't really matter. We just want people to get the information. So feel free to use it as you will.
Yeah, and when we share the tool, it's already branded and there actually is a copyright on there. So it shows both of our agencies, and so we are open to sharing it. We've had to write a couple intros for people so that everybody understands, for those people who haven't actually viewed the presentation. Other questions about the tool?
I would encourage anyone using the tool that any modification you make to the tool, you acknowledge that in your presentation, that it is a modification of the tool presented. A lot of people will do that. Sometimes the scales don't work, or the description of what they are serving in their area does not necessarily work or translate to something that they are working on, but the tool makes sense to use. So I would just be very clear about that it's a modification. Sort of when we talk about the Arizona Self-Sufficiency Matrix, we acknowledge that it's the Arizona Self-Sufficiency Matrix or a modification thereof. So we want to make sure that everyone understands that. Great. So just do it. And LaKeysha, I am going to give this, and then I am going to, I did tell Julianne earlier that we had a mix up in the time. I am going to have to jump off a little early than expected. I will try to jump back on for questions, but I have got to do something else that is exactly, it was supposed to start at 11. So I'm going to give this section and I'm going to jump off. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So some interventions, I mentioned this to you guys earlier. This is just a brief thought on how we think we could really address, and this is in gray skies, right? This is like the disaster is hit, or we know it's coming, or it's hit and we're getting ready to plan for a mark. And is everybody familiar with marks? If not, can you, Julianne, throw that definition in the chat for me, would you? So people know what a mark is. And so one of the things, it's a multi-agency resource center, I'll just say it, but for people that want to read it and capture it, So just some thoughts. Housing and transportation is the vulnerability. Several of you have mentioned that in the chat. The barrier, outreach, and access, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, why we started this is because people weren't being outreached and people didn't have access if they even knew that the resource was available. So actively seeking those populations with limited ability to reach marks. We gave you a couple of tools earlier, but I want to be very specific when I say this. Most organizations know where the populations that are vulnerable are. If you are serving in this field, I would encourage you to already have done the research as to where your most vulnerable populations live, what agencies they frequent. What we do really well here in St. Louis, and I would encourage everybody else to do this as well, and Julianne, I know you guys do it well too, is partnerships. Partnerships. You know, when we put out a flyer, we don't just put it out. We circulate the heck out of it through our community organizations active in disaster, our COAD, our VOAD, our SLARC meetings, our community engagement meetings, our community partner meetings, our community advisory council meetings. We will circulate the heck out of a document via email. And so it's important for us to know, you know, make sure that we get the information out in the best way possible. So actively seeking those individuals with limited ability to reach marks. Now, that means you got to be creative, right? If there are no bus lines, what's next, right? Taxis, Uber, they have Uber Business where you can order an Uber, send it to somebody, and they bill you. You can put in specific, you know, pick up and drop off points, that sort of thing. Do we send out canvas teams? Do we send out teams that will canvas the area, find out who's been affected, and provide the service to them at their home or at their place of business if they still are employed, that sort of thing. So that's some things to think about is in the gray skies, we have to be intentional about getting to the folks that need it. Minority status and language, outreach and access, same barrier. Intentional advertising, places of worship, we mentioned earlier, grocery stores, mobile device stores. A lot of the vulnerable population use minute phones where they have to go and get minutes activated. And so there are specific places that do that. Hair and nail salons, existing agencies, I just talked about this, existing agencies that are frequented by the population. If you know there is a local food distribution point in your area, likely those people are going to be negatively affected by a disaster. So you want to get the information to them because they're still going to need food, right? And so you want to get that information out to them or any other human or social service organizations. I think we think social service, we don't think so much of the human services, human services part of this. I know a couple of people, David and others, are in the human services portion of this. And so reaching out to those agencies as well. Trauma-informed services, refugees and others. We recently had to realize that none of our flyers were being translated. So we had to translate them into Spanish. As you know, St. Louis has the largest Bosnian population outside of Bosnia. And so we had to get the translations for that population. Being culturally competent, understanding how people react to things. I will tell you, our refugee population, our immigrant population, they don't interface with the general public. And so there's certain agencies that do work with them, get the information to those agencies. And then as I just started to mention, our publications, letters, flyers, verbal communication, accounting for the language barriers. Thanks, Laura. Language equity, love it. Love it, love it. Any questions on, do I have more gray skies? Keisha, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, go ahead and bring up those next two. Okay, household composition and disability, barriers, childcare, somebody mentioned that in the chat earlier, elderly care, and mobility. So trauma-informed services for refugees and others, as I mentioned already, cultural competency, mark planning. So we had a mark in the dead of summer, and it was 400 degrees, and we had people sitting outside waiting to get served. And so I don't know if it was LaKeysha and I or John Hidehouse from St. Vincent de Paul, we went to the, I think we were in a school, and practicing in the gym next door, and we went and kindly requested they shut the practice down and allow folks to wait in the gym. And so they did that, and so we were able to get a bunch of chairs and get folks into the gym so that they would not be standing outside in 100-degree St. Louis weather, which, as you know, is the most humid place on earth. And so, so we had to think about that, but it was not thought about when we did the mark, right? Elderly folks, people in wheelchairs, accessibility, and transportation as well. Socioeconomic status. We already talked about the disproportionate effect of disasters on people of color. And then if there are people of color and in poverty, they have double whammy. So long-term recovery, holistic case management programs. We talked about our Pathway of Hope and Pathways to Progress, which are programs that are designed to address issues or barriers to sustainability or stability. And then your housing initiatives. We talked about this earlier in the conversation about those that are homeless, those that are renters, those who, if they are in a rental unit and it is affected negatively by disasters and the landlord is forced to condemn the building, what do the renters do? How quickly can we get them moved into other household accommodations, right? Is there a deposit available? Is there moving available assistance? First and last month's rent available? A lot of the programs that are attached to social service organizations can do that, but if they're not, quote unquote, designated as disaster organizations, we have to bring them into the mix. So that's a part of it. Community characteristics, urban, rural areas, the differences between them. We have a lot of rural counties here in Missouri, and getting access to some of those people in a disaster. LaKeysha can talk to you about the Perry County tornado and a couple of other tornadoes where just getting to the people was a barrier. If you didn't have a 4x4 pickup, it was difficult. And so we couldn't even get to the people. And again, your mark planning. And then access, as I mentioned earlier, is where's the most appropriate place that people will frequent to get this information out. So I'm going to end my portion there. If you have questions, Julianne and LaKeysha can have my email, and I think I put it in the chat very early on. And then LaKeysha, I'll let you go and jump from Blue Skies, and then I will try to jump back on in the next 15 or 20 to see if there's questions that I need to answer specifically. But thank you all so much, and I apologize for the time mix up here. It's been really great presenting to you and seeing some of you who I know. So thank you.
Thank you, Tyrone. We'll miss you.
Yeah.
If there's questions, I'll answer them to the best of my ability. So our next section is what interventions can we apply during blue skies? Blue skies is when we are not in an active disaster. We don't know what blue skies look like here in St. Louis, and I know nobody in the world right now knows what a blue sky looks like, but we want to make sure that we have some planning that happens when we're not in such a rush. So our social justice lens, vulnerability barrier intervention, when we get a chance to sit down at the table, like if we look at minority status and language at that vulnerability, the barriers we see there, and we talked about some of those. Interventions, staff and volunteer training. I'm gonna say this, a lot of times our agencies depend on volunteers who might not necessarily be closely or working or employees of the agency to be able to go through trainings of cultural competency. It's very important that we be intentional about making sure our volunteers have the skill sets to actually interact and serve people who may not be exactly like them, who have different language preferences, who have cultural differences. We had to, Salvation Army, we have canteens that come out and we do a lot of feeding. Well, we have to account for dietary restrictions that, you know, when we're trying to get out and there's a disaster and we want to feed people, we're like, okay, we got to get the food, we got to get it cooking, we got to get out there. but we had to start to make connections during Blue Sky so that we would know who eats what, because what good is it for us to have thousands of pounds of a specific meat, but we're going into an area where the families there don't eat that. They might have those restrictions, whether it's because of health or religious reasons. We want to serve people in the way that they want to be served. Going down to socioeconomic status, the barriers are having no stakeholder or community inputs or limited agency collaborations. One of the things, again, that we've realized that happens in gray skies is that we just call on our volunteers immediately, the people who are already connected to us. But in blue skies, we should be looking at what does our volunteer base actually look like? Do they reflect the communities that we serve? Are all of our volunteers European Americans? Do we have other churches, church groups that are African American or Korean American, or other people to make up who sits at this table? Because if all of those different groups actually sit at the table, they're the stakeholders. This is what the community is made up of. So these are the ones who should be making the decisions on how we actually carry out our disaster services and response. And they'll be the ones that can be immediately called upon during an actual disaster, gray skies. That's something that internally we here in our division at Salvation Army had to take on and realize, our volunteers are not as diverse as they should be. And so that required us to intentionally reach out to different houses of worship to say, hey, can we come and present? Can we come and train you? Can we have you sign up to become an EDS volunteer so that when there is a disaster, you have that information about where certain groups are, what are the practices and protocols, what are the best ways to outreach, what are the best services, and everybody is already integrated into that together, rather than having a disaster and then looking back and realizing that you had whole groups who were not served. And then household composition and disability. Of course, Tyrone talked about those and the difficulties accessing service or no support or mobility. Your groups can really put a lot of support behind the transportation system in your city. Those are things, we often have co-eds say, okay, well, what should we be doing when there's not a disaster? Do we even need to meet? Yeah, you need to meet, because these are the things that we should be working on, knowing that transportation is even more important during a disaster. So if we live in an area that has zero or limited transportation, that's something that a co-ed could be working on as a social justice protocol, or something that they want to implement to help when a disaster does happen. So those are just some ways to build up support systems, some different interventions that can happen that will help ease the path and really take down some of these barriers according to the vulnerabilities in blue skies. So normally we would have another activity in here, but of course we're not together, so we can't do it. But I am prepared to take any questions, and I've got our email addresses up here. Tyrone and I are always available to chat one-on-one if someone is interested. But I'm going to stop sharing right now so that I can see you guys if you have any questions for me. Put them in the chat, or you can call them out.
There is one in the chat. Did you want me to read it?
Yes.
Or Io, you unmuted, so you can ask your own question.
Let me see. So is this from Richard? Can you talk about equity in the planning process? Is that the one you're looking at? Uh-oh, you're muted.
I was referring to the one from Io, because I think you already addressed the planning.
Oh, okay. Wondering how equity reflected within your own organization. Ooh, Io.
Before you answer that, though, I would like to say that I've really enjoyed the presentation. I think that it was both informative, educational, but also engaging in the way that you presented and the information. So I wanted to thank you very much for that, and hope that you will allow us to use your PowerPoint, however that happens. Having said that, this conversation is a result of many things that has been happening within, many discussions that have happened within VOAD around equity in particular. And so I'm really glad that Helena was able to bring this presentation to us. But I'm just wondering how equity is reflected within your own organization. I see that you are of African descent, like myself. I don't know if you're the only one who is visually, I don't know how to say it, but I think you get my point.
I get you, I got you.
I know I often am. And so I also appreciate the fact that it is coming from the perspective of a person of African descent, very much. But I'm wondering how equity is reflected within the own staffing, within your own organization, because what happens within the organization determines what else happens with the organization, whether it's, how to recruit volunteers, where to provide the information about available resources, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, AO. Thank you. Am I saying it right, AO, or is it IO?
No, it's IO, like I owe you a lot of money.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you, Io. I appreciate your words, and that's always that's a good question, because equity is not something that we can just put on and pretend to dole out and then have issues. And so I can speak for my division of Salvation Army, because I know specifically what we've done. We here in St. Louis, a few years ago, Michael Brown was shot. And so we've had a lot of civil unrest that resulted from that. And that really sparked us to look internally at, and by the way, we treated that as a disaster as well and responded. But we had to look internally, what are we doing to address the structural racism internally, and as well as externally, because we don't exist in a vacuum, and how have things that are present in society maybe seeped into the fabric of how we operate. So we've had to take those hard looks, and I'm not going to pretend like it's easy and that it happens quickly. To answer your question, I can say I have the privilege of being in a position in our management level where I do have several colleagues who look like me. And that does provide a sense of psychological safety that others do not necessarily have. And I can also, I can also say that I have our social service director, who is a European American man, is very vocal and intentional about us having equity in our racial makeup of our staff and the services. And so having a leader who is very vocal and uses his privilege, frankly, to advance this cause might not be the reality of everyone, and I can recognize that, but I am very blessed in that that is the reality I live around and that I work in. So we've been able to take some steps. Some of those were actually in the presentation. Our emergency disaster services, we realized that our volunteers were mostly European American. And so when we were in any situations, there was a lot of times some cultural differences that were rising up in how people were being served. And so we needed to diversify our volunteer base. We needed to bring some, not just the European American churches, but the African American churches, the Korean churches. There's a group of, there's a couple mosques. We're reaching out to people to say, hey, we're all in this together. We need to reach out. So there were some internal things that had really just been overlooked as we're, saying, okay, who wants to volunteer? and just going with whoever raised their hand. Now we need to be intentional and seek out people who have an interest, but who maybe didn't hear our call for help, or maybe didn't think we were talking to them.
That last sentence is really, yeah, that's what I find as well.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of some of the things that we've been working on in equity, and then just the Salvation Army as a whole. We're church, and so we've had to be more vocal in putting out these issues about racism and our stance on those, and that it's work, and none of us have arrived. None of us have arrived, but we're getting there. So I appreciate your question. I hope I answered it.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Sure, no problem. Other questions? I don't see any other ones in the chat. Questions about the presentation, the tool, what we're doing, what we've tried to do.
I think everyone wants to make sure that we get them.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I will definitely be listening to this presentation again, maybe by myself. But yeah, it's very helpful.
I see a question in the chat from Richard. It says justice and equity and disaster work, or comment, have to include the planning phases too, definitely. Otherwise, it's just the same old gatekeepers or maybe some tokenistic consultation phase. Ooh. As people involved in humanitarian crisis work, we have to be intentional about shrinking the gap between planners and planned for. Yep, not about me, without me, right? Including being willing to get out of the way of talent that doesn't look like the gatekeepers. I love it. You're so right, Richard. In everything you said, I might have to cut and paste that and put it on my Facebook page. I'll give you credit though. But absolutely, we have to be willing to dig down deep and lean into that uncomfortability that comes with recognizing that we're not necessarily living the reality that we are speaking. And I got a whole presentation on that. That's a whole nother subject about the cognitive dissonance that happens when, it's hard to say, yes, I'm a good person, and yes, I'm participating in a system that's not good. So now what's my responsibility in combating that?
May I make a suggestion?
Sure.
For consideration. It has to do with language. I'm kind of at the point where I don't want to use the words difficult or uncomfortable, because it gives people an out, right? To not address things, to say, well, I don't feel comfortable in this space. And when we're talking about equity and equality and racism, I don't think anybody should have an out. And so it's not a suggestion to you personally. Many people on this call have heard me say this before. But when we have a platform to educate people, giving people an out, people may choose not to talk about something, not to face something, not to address something, and that's their choice. But if they're in a platform, at a place where that is the subject matter, then using language that gives them an out may not be the best language to use. So, and I'm not sure what the best language is to use. I'm not sure if I would use any, but I just wanted to put that out there.
I appreciate that. It's all of our responsibilities. Nobody is exempt. It's a community issue, and it requires a community response from all of us. I see one more question in the chat from James. It says, how are you addressing volunteer fatigue? Because of our 5 years flat of disasters. Yeah. So I feel like social workers are the worst at really doing self-care. We talk about it, but we're the worst at actually doing it. We have really tried to, again, expand and grow our volunteer base. Of course, we have people who are they are the regular volunteers. They want to do things. By really expanding our reach with those different places of worship, with those different community groups that we normally wouldn't partner with or hadn't reached out to, that's really bringing new people in and replenishing our volunteer group so that we're not calling on the same people all the time. This pandemic has really made us push for diversifying our volunteer groups because the first people to go and have to be homebound were the elderly and the older adults. And frankly, those were a lot of our volunteers because they were retired, so they could respond at any time. So we've really been pushed, I'll say again, to reach out to more people, already established groups, different churches, we've reached out to the fraternities and sororities. That's another group if you're looking for African-American groups in particular. African-American sororities and fraternities are formed. There's a ton of them. They're always looking for community service and things to contribute. And so we've partnered with a lot of different groups to present and to become volunteers and really that's how we've reached out a little bit more than normal. So we're not all the way there, but we're getting there. I don't think I see any other questions in the chat, but you guys feel free to reach out, email myself or Tyrone at any time. We are more than happy to talk, and we appreciate your time. We appreciate you being virtually here. It's a little more exciting when we're in person and we got activities, but I really appreciate that you guys are listening, and I value the fact that you are going in this direction and that you are looking for solutions to what you see around you. And we are pleased that you invited us to be a part of that. So thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to join me in putting up your little clapping hands reaction emoji, that would be wonderful. Thank you so very much to you, LaKeysha, and also Tyrone. Before everybody leaves, just make sure that you put your name, agency, and email address in the chat box if you haven't done that already, so that we can send the video and any other documents that we may be able to get from LaKeysha and Tyrone. We'll send those to you. For those of you who are new to New York City VOAD, please visit our website. It is the very first thing listed in the chat box. If you want to scroll up, our website is there. You can go check that out to learn more about us, our Racial Justice and Equity Committee, and our COVID-19 working groups. Helena Duran also put in the chat box an invitation to join the Racial Justice and Equity Committee if you would like to do so. They meet weekly on Tuesdays. I think it was 3 to 4 p.m. was the most recent choice. Helena, is there anything else you want to say?
No, please just email me if you would like to be added to the calendar event to continue this conversation and see how we can continue this work in New York City. Thank you so much, LaKeysha and Tyrone, for your presentation. We were so happy to have you. And this was a really excellent thing for us to get started thinking about and also to deepen our understanding.
Our pleasure. Thank you guys so much. I put our emails in the chat, so in case anybody is wanting to send us something.
Great, and we will also put your bios in the email that goes out with the recording of the presentation. And if you're able to share the slides, we'll add that in as well.
Great, will do.
So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.